Antifa is going to be designated a domestic terrorist organization. This is something the president campaigned on because we have seen a rise in violence perpetuated by Antifa radical people across this country who subscribe to this group. And unfortunately, it's gone widely uncovered by many in the legacy media. It also went completely ignored by the previous administration. Not anymore.
President Donald Trump has officially signed an executive order designating Antifa as a terrorist organization, despite the fact that it's not actually an organization at all. There's no leader, there's no website you can hit up to find someone to interview. It's really a loose collective of people who, I will admit, in some cases have engaged in acts that I don't think are legal. When you meet anyone with any type of physical assault, it's wrong. And I do condemn it. But labeling Antifa as a domestic terror organization is dangerous for a number of different reasons. Because my read of this is that it's not a way of holding people who engage in physical political violence to account. I see this as a way of Trump attempting to intimidate his opponents, protesters. So let me make that case. So his administration is threatening to target all liberal protesters and donors to groups critical of him. So I guess that's now considered domestic terrorism under the president of the United States. This is supposed to be the leader of the free world. But he can't handle backlash. He can't handle protests against him, even peaceful protests. So he's going to sign a ridiculous executive order to, number one, intimidate people, but number two, potentially use force against his political opponents. And I'm not even talking about politicians. I'm talking about ordinary American people who disagree with his policies. And to be sure, there have been some pretty disgusting acts carried out by the Trump administration. There was a story just today about ICE detaining an autistic child and essentially holding this child hostage. I mean, it's just like some of the most disgusting stuff I've seen when it comes to the behavior of these ICE agents. You know, you have an ICE agent that's in plain clothes, masked up. How are you supposed to know that's law enforcement? How are you supposed to know that's an ICE agent? If I'm with a family member and that family member gets snatched up by some random plainclothes individual with a mask on, I'm gonna assume that it is a criminal kidnapping my family member. So anyway, just giving you an example of something that he has done that I've disagreed with. So this kind of behavior has led to protests, and Trump doesn't like that. So this does come in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination, which Trump and the Republicans were quick to blame on Antifa, despite the fact that there's no evidence that Antifa is behind it. It's as ridiculous as the claim that Israel was behind Charlie Kirk's assassination. So in fact, NBC News reported over the weekend that the federal investigation into Kirk's assassination has yet to find a link between the alleged shooter, 22-year-old Tyler Robinson, and left-wing groups on which President Donald Trump and his administration have pledged to crack down on after the killing. Three sources familiar with the probe told NBC News. Now, I think it's entirely possible that Tyler Robinson was a left-winger. You know, his family allegedly said that he had become more left-wing in his politics. But based on what we've learned about Tyler Robinson, it appears that what motivated the disgusting political assassination that he engaged in was the fact that he had a partner who was transgender and he hated what Charlie Kirk had to say about transgender people. Okay, so that is politically motivated. But to tie him to Antifa makes no sense because there's no evidence of that. So one person familiar with the federal investigation said that every indication so far is that this was one guy who did one really bad thing because he found Kirk's ideology personally offensive. Nonetheless, President Trump is using Kirk's horrific murder for political purposes and is now vowing to target not only Antifa, but other groups that he considers left-wing extremists as well. Take a look.
What comes next after designating Antifa a terrorist organization?
We're going to designate too, but we're going to look at the people that funded Antifa, see who they are, where they came from, and why they did.
Okay. So this really does remind me of the excesses we saw from the federal government in the aftermath of 9/11. 9/11, obviously, the worst terrorist attack on US soil. Thousands of innocent Americans died as a result of Al Qaeda's attack. And people are scared. And when people are scared, when people are angry, that's the perfect opportunity for, the federal government and authoritarian figures within the federal government with authoritarian tendencies to take full advantage. And that's what I believe Trump is doing here. Now, anyone who is planning violence, any group, any extremist group in the US that's organized and they're planning on carrying out acts of violence, absolutely, I think the federal government should go after them, regardless of their political ideology. I mean that. But that's not what's happening here. The executive order he signed threatens investigatory and prosecutorial action against those who financially support Antifa. Again, Antifa is a loose collective. It's not an organization. Like, even if you wanted to donate to Antifa, I don't even know how you would do that. But okay, as we explained on the show once before, there are some serious issues with this executive order. For one, anti-fascism is a broad political ideology, not a specific group or organization. And Antifa doesn't have a leader, a roster of known members, or a centralized structure at all, which makes this executive order even more dangerous. Now, some might say, well, if it's not an organization, then we have nothing to worry about. This executive order is null and void, but that's not the case. So here's Mark Bray, author of the book Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, explaining.
The kind of like street level, direct action focused militant anti-fascism of the post-war period is often referred to as Antifa. And it's kind of this nexus of radical left politics and direct action tactics. And it's kind of a way of doing politics. It's a leftist radical milieu. It's not one specific group. I sometimes compare it to feminism, right? Feminism is not a group, but there are feminist groups. Antifa is not a group, but there are Antifa groups.
Okay, so we fully understand what Antifa is. Now, when it's not a centralized group, right, or they don't have like a centralized power structure, well, then it's easier to just label anyone you don't like as Antifa. And that's what I'm concerned about here, that this is going to be an avenue in which the federal government intimidates and prosecutes people who engage in political action, peaceful. I want to be specific. I want to make that distinction, because if it's violent, obviously that is not protected by law. But I'm worried that peaceful protesters are going to be targeted as a result of this executive order. And they're going to be targeted by the president just slapping the label of domestic terrorist onto them and then using lawfare to go after them. And here's the second issue. Trump's order said that he was declaring Antifa a domestic terrorist organization, a designation that does not actually exist under US law. Federal law empowers the government to label overseas groups foreign terrorist organizations, a status that allows the US to freeze their assets and make it a crime to provide material support to them. So is this, look, even though there's nothing under US law that would allow the president to declare Antifa a terrorist organization, a domestic terrorist organization, do you think that's going to stop him? Is it possible that some of the protesters that the federal government doesn't like could have their assets freezed? So these are the things that we need to consider and think about. And by the way, if this were Biden, I would be equally as disgusted. Because I remember when, the shutdowns had happened during COVID. And there were plenty of conservative protesters who were peacefully protesting. And I did not think the federal government should have gone after them in any way, shape, or form. Now, if they engaged in violence, that's something entirely different. But they had the right to protest the shutdowns, especially because the shutdowns did deprive Americans of their livelihoods in many cases. And also, on top of that, it is especially challenging for families with children. When schools were shut down, they still had to work from home, but they had a difficult time ensuring that their kids were getting the proper remote learning that they needed to continue their schooling. It was a difficult time. So I had no problem with people protesting the shutdowns. And those people were predominantly right wing. Now, there's no equivalent domestic terrorism law. It's been debated for years whether or not there should be a domestic terror law, but so far it hasn't come to fruition because of concerns that it would infringe on Americans' First Amendment rights. And those are legitimate concerns. So Trump's order lacks actual teeth that would give the federal government more power, although he would challenge that in the court system. And in some of these federal court rulings, they have sided with Trump. I mean, I think it was the Supreme Court just ruled that Trump has the right to fire, FTC members that he doesn't like, essentially overturning 90 years of precedent in this country. So who knows how this would play out if Trump challenged it in the courts. The Antifa order directs agencies to investigate, disrupt, and dismantle any and all illegal operations by the movement, meaning Antifa, something they already have the authority to do. But the impotency of this specific order does not mean that we shouldn't be concerned about Trump's decision. We should be concerned about this executive order. So as he himself admitted, he says it out loud, it's part of a broader crackdown on liberals, liberal groups. So last week, 2 senior administration officials said that cabinet secretaries and federal department heads were working to identify organizations that funded or supported violence against conservatives. One tactic has been to target the tax-exempt status of nonprofits. I actually don't have a problem with that, to be honest with you. I think nonprofits should be investigated far more than they have been, not just because of funding of violence. I think a lot of these nonprofits actually operate as lobbying groups, and they get to operate with dark money funding. And we have no idea about the influences in our political system or the influences that essentially lead our politicians to make certain decisions that they make. But that's a different story entirely. But which one is it here? So is it groups that fund violence or groups that are simply critical of Donald Trump? Kind of unclear here. But honestly, when it comes to Trump and his past behavior, it really does sound like the latter. And so you either believe in our Constitution and you believe in protecting everyone's right to peacefully assemble and to protest our government, or you don't. And if you don't believe in that, then you don't believe in our Constitution, you don't believe in what this country stands for. So I guess we're gonna have to wait and see how this really plays out. But it is amazing to me how the most leaders, and this isn't just about America, leaders worldwide who tend to have authoritarian tendencies, the real strong men, tend to have the thinnest skin, don't they? They can't wait for an opportunity to infringe on people's freedom of speech or any freedoms that they may have. So that's what we're dealing with right now. We'll see how this plays out. But in my opinion, this is not looking good. And you shouldn't allow tragic events in this country to be exploited by any politicians, any political leaders for their own agenda and political means. And that's what's happening right now. If someone who is, considered an Antifa person engages in violence, arrest them, prosecute them, bring them to justice. But to do this like broad, generalized, executive order, in my opinion, that's targeting people who disagree with your politics, I find that so pathetic and unconstitutional.
Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.